If you stand on the ground and look at a skyscraper, it looks like a monument to stability. It looks like a mountain that has been tamed and carved into a rectangle. It looks immovable. But if you are the man standing on the 80th floor in 1930, you know the truth. The building is alive. It is a giant vertical tuning fork, and the wind is the player. The physics of the skyscraper is not the physics of the stone. It is the physics of the sway. In 1929, we were entering the era of the skeleton. Before this, buildings were supported by their walls, thick, heavy masonry that resisted the wind through sheer mass. But the new skyscrapers were different. They were made of steel, and steel is flexible. It is designed to move. It has to move or it will snap. But when you are building without a crane, when you are jumping 10-ton derricks and throwing white-hot rivets, the sway is not a feature, it is a predator. Imagine you are a connector. You are standing on a beam that is vibrating with the energy of the wind. You look down the length of the building and you realize that the top of the tower is moving 3, 4, maybe 5 feet in either direction. The horizon isn't still, it is tilting. Now imagine trying to land a 10-ton beam into a hole the size of a nickel while the entire world is moving beneath your feet. This was the mechanical seasickness of the ironworker. The men had to develop a wind sense. They had to learn to time their movements with the oscillation of the building. You didn't just walk across a beam, you surfed it. You waited for the building to reach the end of its sway, the dwell point, before you made your move. And then there was the great jump. This is the central mystery of the craneless era. If the guy derrick is the machine that lifts the building, how does the machine get to the top? How does a 10,000-pound steel mast move itself from the 40th floor to the 42nd? It is a feat of mechanical levitation that seems impossible until you see it done. They called it jumping the stick, and it was the most dangerous hour in the life of a skyscraper. To jump the derrick, you have to disconnect it. You have to turn a stable, anchored machine into a free-floating weight. First, the crew would use the derrick to lift its own boom. They would detach the boom from the base of the mast and hoist it up to the next level. They would anchor the boom to the new steel, turning it into a temporary vertical pole. Now the roles are reversed. The boom, which is usually the arm, is now the support. The mast, which is usually the spine, is now the load. The crew would rig a series of pulleys and cables between the boom and the mast. The bellman would signal the hoister in the basement. Clang, clang, the steam engine would scream, the cables would pull taut, and slowly, terrifyingly, the 5-ton mast would begin to rise out of its socket. This is the pivot of death. For 20 minutes, the derrick is suspended in midair. It is not bolted down. It is not braced. If a gust of wind hits the mast now, it becomes a lever with enough force to shear the boom in half and collapse the entire top of the building. The men are standing around the hole, their hands on the vibrating steel, trying to guide the mast into its new socket on the upper floor. They are literally catching the crane with their bare hands. There are no safety sensors, no computer-controlled winches to keep it level. It is all down to the bell and the brawn. One mistake by the hoister, one jerk of the lever, and the mast will whip. It will lurch to the side, crushing the men against the girders. When the mast finally slides into its new step, a heavy iron cup on the new floor, the men don't cheer. They have no time. They have to immediately re-rig the guy wires. They have to tighten the 6 cables that hold the mast vertical. But how do you know if a 1,000-foot-tall building is vertical? You use a transit and a plumb. If one wire is too tight, the derrick is out of plumb. If it's too loose, the mast will buckle under the weight of the next beam. The men would turn the turnbuckles using 6-foot iron bars, leaning their entire body weight into the screw. You could hear the cables singing, a high-pitched metallic whir that meant the steel was under thousands of pounds of tension. The jump happened every 2 floors. On a building like the Empire State, they jumped the derricks 50 times. 50 hours of high-stakes gambling with 5 tons of steel. And they did it all without a single modern crane. We have talked about the brawn of the steel, but a skyscraper is also a crystal palace. It is a mountain of glass and a skin of stone. The logistics of moving 10,000 windows to the 70th floor without a crane is a story of mechanical gentleness. In 1930, we didn't have glass suction lifts. We didn't have protective plastic films. Every pane of glass was hand-cut, hand-loaded, and hand-installed. The glass traveled in the material hoist. Imagine the vibration. The hoist is a raw wooden platform, and it's being pulled by a thundering steam engine. If the platform hits a bump in the guide rails, if the cable chatters, the glass will shatter. A crate of glass exploding in a 1,000-foot shaft is a rain of crystal daggers. It can slice through a man's coat 3 floors below. The glaziers, the glassmen, were the perfectionists of the site. They had to move these crates across the open beams using small handcarts with wooden wheels to minimize the vibration. And then they had to set the glass. The wind is his greatest enemy. A pane of glass is a sail. If a gust hits the glass while the glazier is holding it, the glass becomes an aerofoil. It will pull the man right out of the building. They had to learn to read the wind by watching the smoke from the chimneys of the buildings below. If the smoke was horizontal, you didn't set glass. If the smoke was rising, you had a lull. And then there was the stone. The skin of the building, the limestone and the brick, moved in the stone hoist. Unlike the steel, which could be swung into place by the derrick, the stone had to be staged. They would create transfer floors every 20 levels. The stone would be hoisted to the 20th floor, then moved by handcart across the building to another hoist, which would take it to the 40th. It was a vertical relay race. 10,000 tons of stone, 50,000 tons of brick, moving in a continuous upward stream. If the relay broke, if one hoist operator fell asleep, the entire skin of the building stopped growing, and in the race for the sky, if you stop growing, you are losing money. How do you feed 3,000 men when the nearest restaurant is 80 floors down? In 1929, you didn't send them to the street for lunch. A worker who goes to the street is a worker who is gone for an hour. In a floor-a-day schedule, you cannot lose 3,000 man-hours to a sandwich. So the restaurant came to the sky. The sky cafeterias were one of the great logistical miracles of the Craneless era. They were temporary, mobile kitchens that climbed with the building. The commissary was located every 20 floors. They would hoist up massive ovens, crates of bread, barrels of pickles, and hundreds of hot coffee. We see the famous photos and think they are posing. They aren't. They are exhausted. This was the only 30 minutes of the day when the hammers stopped. It was the only 30 minutes when they could stop fighting gravity. But even lunch was a logistical challenge. Every crumb, every piece of wax paper, every coffee cup had to be accounted for. If a man threw a sandwich crust off the 70th floor, it could hit a worker below and cause him to flinch, a flinch that leads to a fall. The scavengers, usually the youngest boys, would walk the floors with burlap sacks, picking up every piece of trash. And the water. At first, they had the water boys, but as the buildings reached 800 feet, the buckets weren't enough. They had to pump the water. This was the first time we mastered vertical plumbing. To get water to the top, you had to build reservoirs every 10 floors. The water would be pumped to the 10th floor tank, then a second pump would take it to the 20th, and so on. It was a ladder of water. Without these pumps, the men would have withered in the heat. Without the sky cafeterias, the building would have starved. The skyscraper was a city in a cage. It had its own restaurants, its own plumbing, its own transportation system, the hoists, and its own law, the foreman. It was a civilization that existed only in the vertical plane. To work in the craneless world, you had to undergo a psychological mutation. Human beings are not designed for the abyss. We have an instinct called the call of the void, that terrifying urge to jump when you are at a height. Most people feel it and pull back. The ironworker felt it and leaned in. They developed what they called the high steel stare. It was a form of target fixation. They learned to stop seeing the depth. They stopped seeing the 800 feet of empty air. Instead, they saw the plane. To an ironworker, the 4-inch beam wasn't a tightrope over a canyon, it was just a 4-inch path on a flat surface. They trained their brains to ignore the ground. The ground was the map, the beam was the reality. If you looked at the map, you died. This psychological narrowing was the only way to survive, but it came at a cost. When these men came down to the street at the end of the day, they felt compressed. The wide, flat sidewalks felt dangerous. The cars felt too close. The noise of the city felt overwhelming. Many of them were vertical addicts. They only felt safe when they were in the sky. They only felt normal when they were balancing on the edge of oblivion.
Quick favor before we continue. Like the video and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, but it helps this channel a lot. Thank you. Let's continue. Before there was a skyline, there was a silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of an impossibility. For the entirety of human history, we were horizontal creatures. We built outward. We conquered the plains, the forests, and the oceans, but we were always chained to the earth by a singular, unyielding law, the crushing weight of the brick. If you look at the Great Pyramids or the cathedrals of the Middle Ages, you see the limit of our ambition. To go high, you had to go wide. To support a spire, you needed a base that could cover a city block. We were prisoners of geometry. But in the 1920s, a madness took hold of the American spirit. It was a madness born of steel, fueled by coal, and executed by men who had forgotten how to feel fear. They decided that New York City would no longer grow outward, it would grow upward. It would become a forest of iron, a vertical civilization where the ground was merely a memory. But how? How do you take 365,000 tons of steel and stone, the weight of a mountain, and balance it on a single city block? How do you lift that weight into the clouds when the most advanced machine in your arsenal is a puffing steam engine and a length of hemp rope? How do you build a skyscraper without a crane? To answer that, you have to stop looking at the clouds. You have to look at the mud. You have to look at the dark, wet, claustrophobic world beneath the pavement. Because before the Empire State Building could touch the sun, it had to survive the purgatory of the Manhattan schist. Manhattan is an island of ghosts, but its truest ghost is its geology. Beneath the taxicabs and the neon lights lies a metamorphic rock called schist. It is a jagged, sparkling gray stone that was forged 450 million years ago in the collision of continents. It is one of the hardest substances on the planet. It is the only thing on Earth capable of holding the weight of a skyscraper. But in 1929, that rock was buried. It sat 50, 60, 80 feet beneath a layer of treacherous liquid mud and quicksand. To build, you had to reach it. You had to anchor the skeleton of the building to the bones of the earth. And that meant sending men into the caissons. A caisson is a word that sounds elegant, but the reality was a torture chamber. Imagine a giant wooden box the size of a small house with no bottom. It is lowered into the mud. To keep the Hudson River from flooding the workspace, massive air compressors on the surface pumped the box full of air, high-pressure air. Inside that box were the sandhogs. The sandhogs were the elite infantry of the foundation. They were mostly immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, men who had come to America with nothing but their backs and a willingness to die for $5 a day. They would enter an airlock at the surface. A heavy steel door would clang shut behind them, and the pressure would begin to rise. The sound of the air entering the lock was like a scream that never ended. Your eardrums would throb, then they would bulge. If you couldn't clear your ears by swallowing or pinching your nose, the pressure would eventually rupture the drum. Men would exit the lock with blood trickling from their ears, their hearing gone forever. But that was just the beginning. Once the pressure in the lock matched the pressure in the caisson, a trapdoor in the floor would open. The men would descend a narrow, slippery ladder into the dark. The air inside a caisson is not like the air you and I breathe. It is thick. It is heavy. It feels like walking through invisible syrup. Because it is so compressed, it holds more oxygen, which sounds like a benefit, but it's a curse. In that hyper-oxygenated environment, a single spark from a shovel hitting a stone could turn into a blowtorch. Candles burned twice as fast. A man's heart would beat faster. His lungs would work harder. He was aging in double time. And the heat, even in the dead of a New York winter when the wind above was slicing through wool coats, it was 90 degrees inside the caisson. The friction of the air molecules being shoved into that tiny space created a sweltering, humid hell. The sandhogs worked in 4-hour shifts. They would shovel the mud into buckets, and those buckets would be winched up through the airlock. As they removed the mud, the caisson, weighted down by thousands of tons of concrete on top, would sink an inch, then another inch. They were digging their own grave, hoping to find the rock before the rock found them. This was the dig. It was a primitive, brutal battle between human muscle and the weight of the Atlantic Ocean. There were no excavators, no jackhammers, just a shovel, a pick, and a man's ability to endure the squeeze. But the real horror didn't happen when you went down. The real horror happened when you tried to come home. If you leave a high-pressure environment too quickly, your body rebels. The nitrogen that has been forced into your blood and tissues by the caisson air begins to expand. It turns into bubbles. Think of a bottle of soda. When the cap is on, the bubbles are invisible, but the moment you twist that cap, psst, the gas escapes and the liquid foams. Now imagine that happening inside your veins, inside your joints, inside your brain. They called it caisson disease, but the men had a simpler name for it. They called it the bends. A man would leave the site, feeling fine. He would walk to a local pub to wash the mud out of his throat, and halfway there, he would suddenly double over. His joints would feel like they were being filled with broken glass. His back would arch in an involuntary, agonizing curve, the C shape that gave the disease its name. If he was lucky, the pain would eventually fade, leaving him with a permanent limp. If he was unlucky, the bubbles would reach his spinal cord, paralyzing him from the waist down. If he was truly cursed, they would reach his heart or his brain.
The construction companies knew this was happening. They weren't stupid. They had doctors on staff. But in the 1920s, the speed of progress was the only metric that mattered. If you decompressed the men too slowly, you lost money. If you decompressed them fast, you lost men. And in 1929, men were the cheapest material on the job site. Every skyscraper in New York is built on a foundation of bends. Thousands of men spent their old age in wheelchairs or with twisted limbs because they spent their youth in the caissons, digging for the rock that would hold up the Chrysler in the Empire State. But finally, after months of digging, the shovels would stop. They would hear a different sound, not the squelch of mud, but the clink of steel on stone, the schist. Once they hit the rock, the caissons were filled with concrete, turning them into massive, immovable piers. The roots of the building were set. Now the building could begin its climb. Now we leave the mud and enter the world of the steam heart. Because to build a skyscraper without a crane, you first have to understand the machine that replaced the crane. You have to understand the donkey engine. If you walked onto a construction site in 1929, the first thing you would notice wasn't the height, it was the smell. It was the smell of burning soft coal, hot oil, and scorched iron. In 2024, our construction sites are quiet. We use electricity. We use hydraulics. The power is invisible. In 1929, the power was a monster. It was the steam hoist, often called the donkey engine. It was a primitive, violent device, a huge vertical boiler filled with water, sitting over a coal fire. The steam generated by that fire was piped into two massive cylinders that drove a rotating drum. Wrapped around that drum was thousands of feet of steel cable. This engine was the heart of the skyscraper. It was the only reason the building could grow. Without it, the steel was just dead weight. With it, the steel could fly. But moving a 10-ton steam engine up a building as it grows is its own form of madness. The donkey engine didn't stay on the ground. As the building rose, the engine had to rise with it. Every few floors, the hoister, the man who operated the engine, would have to jump his machine. They would build a temporary wooden platform on the new floor. They would rig up a series of pulleys and cables, and then the engine would literally pull itself up the side of the building. It would hiss and groan, the wooden platforms creaking under its multi-ton weight, while the hoister stood at the levers, praying the cables wouldn't snap. If the engine fell, it didn't just break,
It exploded. A pressurized steam boiler falling 10 stories is a bomb. It would take out the floor, the men, and the very foundation they had just spent months building. But the Hoister was a special breed. He lived in a world of grease and coal dust. He was the brain of the lift. He sat in the dark, surrounded by the roar of his engine, unable to see the sky, unable to see the building he was creating. He was flying blind. He was connected to the world above by a single wire, a wire that led to a bell. And this is where the Craneless miracle truly begins. To lift the steel, you didn't need a computer. You didn't need a laser. You needed a man on the edge of the abyss with a bell cord in his hand. The Bellman. Imagine standing on a piece of steel 4 inches wide. The wind is gusting at 40 miles per hour. Your coat is whipping around your legs. Below you, the yellow taxi cabs look like grains of rice. You are the Bellman. In your hand is a thin cord. That cord runs all the way down, through the skeleton of the building to the Hoister's engine. You are the eyes of the machine. Down on the street, a horse-drawn wagon has pulled up. On that wagon is a 10-ton I-beam, 60 feet long. It is the spine of the 41st floor. The Derrick, the guy Derrick, that primitive steel mast, reaches down. The Bellman watches. He doesn't use a radio. He doesn't use a walkie-talkie. He waits for the precise moment when the wagon is still, when the wind lulls. He pulls the cord. Clang! One ring. Down in the dark, the Hoister hears the bell. He pulls the lever. The steam engine screams. The drum spins. The cable pulls taut, and the steel begins to rise. A 10-ton beam rising at 500 feet per minute is not a tool, it's a weapon. If it hits the side of the building, it can shear off the rivets and bring the floor down. If the wind catches it, it can start to spin, turning into a giant metallic propeller that will slice through anything in its path. The Bellman has to tame the beam. He uses taglines. These are just ropes held by men on the lower floors. They pull and tug at the rising steel, trying to keep it from spinning, trying to keep it steady. It's a tug of war between 10 tons of metal and the muscle of 4 men. Clang, clang, 2 rings. The Hoister slows the engine. The beam slows down as it approaches the top. Now the choreography becomes intimate. The beam is inches away from the columns. The connectors, the madmen who live at the very peak, reach out. They grab the swinging steel with their bare hands. They guide it into place. They align the holes. They shove a drift pin through the holes to hold it temporarily. Clang! 1 ring. The engine stops. The cable goes slack. The beam is home. This process was repeated 10,000 times, 20,000 times. Every single piece of the Empire State Building was lifted this way. No computer, no hydraulics, just a man, a bell, and a steam engine. But the steel skeleton is only the beginning. Once the beam is in place, it has to be fixed. It has to be fused into the building. And that requires the most dangerous, most violent, and most rhythmic part of the story. The Rivet Gang. If the guy Derrick was the arm that lifted America into the sky, the rivet was the thread that sewed it together. But to call a rivet a fastener is like calling a heartbeat a muscle contraction. It is technically true, but it misses the soul of the thing. In 1929, we did not have the high-strength bolts we use today. We did not have the portable arc welders that allow a single man to fuse beams together with a flash of blue light. In the 1920s, the skyscraper was held together by fire. It was held together by a technology that had changed very little since the ironclads of the Civil War. But on the 50th floor, in a 40-mile-per-hour wind, that technology became a deadly high-speed ballet. They worked in groups of 4. They called it a rivet gang. And you have to understand that these 4 men were not individuals. They were a single 4-headed machine. If one man stumbled, the machine broke. If one man slowed down, the building stopped. If one man made a mistake, someone, usually one of the 4, was going to die. At the head of this machine was the heater. The heater was the alchemist. He was the chef of the sky. His kitchen was a small, portable forge, a tripod of iron holding a bed of burning coke. His job was deceptively simple. Take a cold steel rivet and turn it white hot. But white hot is a specific, dangerous temperature. If the rivet is too cold, it won't mushroom when it's hit, and the joint will be weak. If it's too hot, if it reaches the point where it starts to spark like a 4th of July sparkler, the steel has burnt. The carbon has been cooked out of it. It becomes brittle. It becomes useless. The heater had to judge the temperature by eye in the shifting light of the sun and the shadows of the girders. He had to account for the wind, which would blow the heat off his forge. He had to account for the travel time, the seconds the rivet would spend flying through the air, losing degrees every foot it traveled. He would reach into the coals with a pair of long-handled tongs, his leather gloves smoking from the heat. He would pull out a rivet that was glowing with a terrifying, incandescent beauty, and then he would throw it. This is the moment that stops the heart of every person who ever watched a skyscraper rise: the pitch. The heater isn't throwing this rivet to a man standing on a wide floor. He is throwing it to the catcher, who is standing on a beam no wider than your palm. The rivet is moving fast. It is 300 degrees. It is a molten bullet. The catcher doesn't have a baseball mitt. He doesn't have a net. He has a can. It's a simple tin bucket, sometimes lined with a bit of wood or asbestos to keep the rivet from bouncing out. Imagine the physics of this catch. You are 600 feet in the air. The wind is buffeting your body, trying to shove you off the beam. You are holding a tin can in one hand. You see a white-hot spark flying towards you at 30 miles per hour. You cannot move your feet. You cannot step into the catch. If you move 6 inches to the left, you are dead. You have to catch it with your eyes. You have to track that glowing point of light against the chaotic backdrop of the New York City streets below. If he misses, the rivet becomes a meteor. It falls. It gathers speed. By the time it hits the street, it is moving fast enough to punch through the roof of a car or the skull of a pedestrian. But the catcher rarely missed. It was a matter of professional pride. It was a matter of life. The moment the rivet hit the can, the catcher would reach in with his own tongs. He would pluck the glowing metal out and pass it. He would jam the hot rivet into the hole that had been pre-drilled through the 2 overlapping beams. Now the clock is ticking. The rivet is losing heat. It is turning from white to a cherry red. If it cools too much, the joint is a failure. Now come the heavies, the bucker-upper and the gunman. The bucker-upper has the most thankless job in the sky. He has to stand on the wrong side of the beam. He is often leaning out over the edge, held only by the friction of his boots. He takes his dolly bar, a heavy, blunt instrument, and presses it against the head of the hot rivet. He is the anchor. He has to resist the violence that is about to come from the other side. He has to be a stone wall. On the other side of the beam stands the gunman. He is holding a pneumatic hammer. In 1929, these were known as rivet guns. They were powered by compressed air, fed by long, snaking rubber hoses that ran all the way down to the steam compressors in the basement. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. The sound is cataclysmic. It is not a noise. It is a physical assault. The pneumatic hammer strikes the rivet 2,000 times a minute. It is a vibrating, screaming beast of iron. The gunman has to use his entire body, his shoulders, his chest, his arms, to drive the hammer into the glowing steel. The hot rivet, trapped between the gunman's hammer and the bucker-upper's dolly bar, has nowhere to go. The steel begins to flow. It mushrooms. It expands inside the hole, filling every microscopic gap between the 2 beams. But it's not just the shaping of the head that matters. It's the cooling. As the gunman hammers, the rivet begins to lose its glow. It turns dark. As it cools, the steel contracts. It shrinks. This is the secret power of the rivet. Because it was installed while hot, as it shrinks, it pulls the 2 beams together with a force that no bolt can match. It clamps the building together. A skyscraper is not just a pile of steel. Because of the rivet, it becomes a single, fused, monolithic structure. The rivets turn 1,000 individual beams into one solid skeleton of iron. But look at the gunman's hands. If you could see through his gloves, you would see fingers that are white, numb, and lifeless. The vibration of the pneumatic hammer was a slow-motion execution. It destroyed the capillaries in the hands. It killed the nerves. They called it white finger or dead hand. A man could spend 10 years as a gunman, and by the end, he couldn't feel the warmth of his wife's hand. He couldn't feel the cold of a glass of beer. His hands were just tools, calloused, scarred, and vibrating with a ghost rhythm that never went away. And the noise. In the 1920s, there was no OSHA, there were no foam earplugs, there were no noise-canceling headphones. The gunman and the bucker-upper stood inches away from a 130-decibel explosion 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. They didn't just go deaf, their ears died. The tiny hairs in the inner ear were flattened like wheat in a hurricane. By the time an iron worker was 30, he lived in a world of muffled shadows. He learned to read lips. He learned to feel the vibration of voices through the floorboards. The rat-tat-tat of the rivet gun was the heartbeat of New York City, but for the men who triggered it, it was a siren song that led to a lifetime of silence. Every day, a single rivet gang would drive 500 rivets, 600, 700. The Empire State Building has 10 million rivets. 10 million times a heater cranked his forge. 10 million times a catcher snapped his can. 10 million times a gunman destroyed his hearing. And they did it all without a crane. Because the Craneless miracle wasn't just about the guy Derrick, it was about the logistics of the supply chain that fed these fires. To keep 10 million rivets flowing, you needed a vertical railroad. You needed a system of movement that made the New York City subway look like a toy. You needed the hoist. This is the part of the skyscraper story that is rarely told. We focus on the top, on the heroes in the sun. But the top cannot exist without the veins. In 1929, the internal hoist was the most dangerous machine ever invented. It was a high-speed elevator with no walls, no safety brakes, and no mercy. It was the only way to get the materials to the sky. And to understand how America built without cranes, we have to look at the men who operated the hoists, the men who lived in the dark moving the mountain one barrel of coal at a time. Because the skyscraper wasn't built by lifting steel, it was built by feeding the fire.
If the roughneck on the beam was the face of the American skyscraper, then the hoister in the basement was its soul. We often think of these buildings as static objects, monuments of stone and steel that simply appeared in the skyline. But in the 1920s, a skyscraper under construction was a living, breathing, hungry animal. It was a vertical factory that never slept, a machine that consumed thousands of tons of material every single day. And every pound of that material, every rivet, every brick, every bucket of mortar, and every lump of coal had to travel 1,000 feet straight up, without a crane. In modern construction, you see the tower crane perched on the top, an elegant bird of prey that reaches down to the street and gently places its load exactly where it's needed. It is a slow, graceful, and highly controlled process. But in 1929, there was no grace. There was only the vertical railroad. Inside the skeleton of the rising tower, engineers would build a series of temporary shafts. These were not the polished brass-doored elevators of the finished building. These were the material hoists. They were raw, wooden platforms, open on all sides, held together by iron bolts and sheer luck.
They were the veins of the building, and they moved with a speed that would terrify a modern observer. The hoister didn't glide, it screamed. These platforms traveled at speeds of up to 1,000 feet per minute. To put that in perspective, that is faster than many modern office elevators, and they were doing this in 1930 using steam power and hemp core cables inside a building that was literally swaying in the wind. The hoist was a guillotine that moved in both directions. There were no safety gates. There were no door sensors. If a worker leaned too far into the shaft to see where the platform was, the platform would take his head off before he even heard the cable whistle. But why the speed? Why the rush? Because of the feeding. To keep a skyscraper rising at the record-breaking pace of the 1920s, sometimes a floor a day, you had to feed the beast. At the top of the building, you had dozens of heaters with their forges. Those forges required coal, soft bituminous coal that had to be shoveled into barrels on the street, hoisted to the 60th floor, and then carried by hand across open beams to the gang. If the coal stopped moving, the fire went out. If the fire went out, the rivets stayed cold. If the rivets stayed cold, the building died. The man responsible for this vertical chaos was the hoister. He was the pilot of the dark. The hoister lived in the basement, or sometimes on the second floor, tucked away in a corner of the structure where the sun never reached. He spent 10 hours a day surrounded by the thundering rhythm of his engine. His world was one of hissing valves, the smell of scorched oil, and the terrifying tension of the drum. He couldn't see the platform he was moving. He couldn't see the men who were loading it. He couldn't see the 800 feet of empty space above him. He operated entirely by the marks and the bell. As the cable wound on the drum, the hoister would watch for specific marks he had painted onto the steel. A white stripe meant the 10th floor. A red stripe meant the 40th. A yellow stripe meant slow down or you'll fly off the top of the building. But the marks were only a guide. The true command came from the bellman. In the previous section, we talked about the basic bell code. 1 ring for stop, 2 for up. But in reality, the language of the bell was as complex as Morse code. A short snap followed by a long pull might mean bring it up slow, the load is top heavy. A series of rapid taps meant emergency, stop the drum now. The hoister had to hear these bells over the deafening roar of his own engine, the hammering of the rivet guns above, and the chaos of the New York streets outside. He had to develop engine ear, a psychological condition where the man becomes so tuned to the frequency of his machine that he can hear a pin drop in the next room, but can't hear his own wife speaking to him at dinner. If the hoister lost his focus for a heartbeat, if he misread a mark or missed a bell, the result was a Skyline smash. The cable would snap. Thousands of pounds of steel, coal, and equipment would enter a state of free fall. When a hoist platform falls from the 70th floor, it doesn't just land, it becomes a kinetic bomb. It would punch through the temporary wooden flooring, shearing off bolts and descending through the building like a hot knife through butter until it hit the basement, exploding in a cloud of splinters and iron. The newspapers of the 1920s rarely reported these accidents. The skyscraper kings, the men like Chrysler and Raskop, had a silent agreement with the press. The skyscraper was a symbol of American triumph, and triumph doesn't include the story of a hoist operator who was crushed because a cable frayed. But the men on the site knew. They called the hoist shafts the throat, because it was the place where the building swallowed you whole. And yet, despite the danger, the men would ride the ball. Technically, it was illegal. The insurance companies forbade it. The foreman threatened to fire anyone caught doing it. But if you're a worker on the ground and your gang is on the 50th floor, you have 2 choices. You can spend 30 minutes climbing a series of rickety, vertical wooden ladders, exhausting your muscles before you even start work. Or you can hook a ride. They would step on the rim of a cement bucket or straddle the headache ball like a horse. They would give the bellman a wink. Clang, clang, and suddenly they were flying. Imagine the sensation. No walls, no floor, just you, a steel cable, and the entire city of New York unfolding beneath your boots like a map of the world. You could see the steamships in the harbor, the smoke from the factories in Queens, the tiny ant-like people on the sidewalk. It was a moment of godlike perspective, but it was a perspective that came with a price. If the wind gusted, if the hoister jerked the lever, if your hands, slick with sweat or grease, slipped for 1 second, you weren't a worker anymore, you were a statistic. The men who rode the ball were the ultimate gamblers. They were the ones who believed that the Craneless miracle was something they had mastered. They believed they had conquered gravity. But gravity never forgets. While the heavy materials moved by hoist, the lifeblood of the building moved by hand. This is the story of the water boys. We often romanticize the 1920s as a time of old-world craftsmanship, but it was also a time of brutal child labor. Many of the boys who worked the skyscraper sites were barely teenagers. They were the gophers, the runners. Their job was simple: keep the men hydrated. A rivet gang in August, working next to a 2,000-degree forge, loses gallons of sweat an hour. If they stop to go get water, the building stops, so the water has to come to them. The water boy would fill 2 heavy buckets, each weighing 40 pounds, and he would begin the climb. There were no stairs, there were no ramps, there were only ladders. These weren't the sturdy fiberglass ladders you find at a hardware store. They were temporary wooden structures, often made on site from scrap lumber. They were narrow, slippery with oil, and often vibrated with the rhythm of the building. The water boy had to navigate this vertical maze while carrying 80 pounds of sloshing liquid. If he spilled the water, the men would curse him. They might even throw a cold rivet at him. If he was slow, he was a girl. If he was scared, he was a coward. But the trial of the water boy wasn't just hazing, it was a filter. The construction bosses used the water boys to find the next generation of ironworkers. They were looking for the kids who didn't look down. They were looking for the kids who could walk a beam with a bucket in each hand and not lose their balance. If you survived 2 years as a water boy, if you didn't fall, if you didn't break, then on your 17th birthday, you were given a wrench. You were graduated to the gang. Every great skywalker of the 1930s started as a terrified kid with a water bucket. They learned the craneless world from the bottom up, one rung at a time, until the height didn't matter anymore, until the abyss was just a place where they kept their tools. Once the steel was up, the building was still just a ghost. It was a cage of iron. To make it a skyscraper, you had to give it a skin. You had to wrap it in millions of bricks and thousands of tons of Indiana limestone. And this is where the craneless logistics reached their peak of complexity. How do you lay 10 million bricks on the side of a building when there is no ground to stand on? You use the suspended scaffold. The bricklayers were not roughnecks. They didn't have the same swagger as the ironworkers. They were craftsmen, masons, men who worked with precision and trowels. But their job was in many ways more terrifying. The ironworker always had a beam beneath his feet. The bricklayer had only a platform. The suspended scaffold was a narrow wooden deck, maybe 4 feet wide, hanging from the roof by steel outriggers and cables. It was a swing. Imagine trying to lay a perfectly straight line of masonry while your floor is swaying 3 feet in either direction. The wind was the bricklayer's enemy. On a gusty day, the scaffold would pull away from the building. The men would have to use grab hooks to try and pull themselves back in, fighting the vacuum created by the wind whipping around the corners of the tower. If a cable jammed, if one side of the scaffold jacked faster than the other, the platform would tilt. Bricks would start to slide, the mortar tubs would spill, and if the tilt became too steep, the men would simply slide off. They called it slipping the skin. There are accounts from the construction of the Chrysler building of a scaffold that tilted 45 degrees during a summer thunderstorm. The men clung to the cables, dangling over Lexington Avenue as their bricks rained down on the crowds below like red hailstones. They weren't rescued by a crane. There was no safety basket. The other workers had to lower a rope from the floor above, and one by one, the masons had to climb the rope, hand over hand, leaving their tools and their livelihood to fall into the street. We must return one last time.
If you could cut a skyscraper in half during the winter of 1930, you wouldn't see an office building. You would see a factory, a vertical, coal-fired, steam-driven factory that was locked in a life-or-death struggle with the laws of thermodynamics.
We have talked about the guy Derrick and the rivet gang. We have looked at the men who stood in the sun. But the skyscraper had an interior life that was much darker, much hotter, and infinitely more dangerous. The building had a heart, and that heart was made of fire. In 2026, our buildings are silent. They are powered by invisible electrons flowing through copper wires buried in the walls. The power of a modern skyscraper is sterile. It is odorless. In 1929, the power was a physical weight. It was a mountain of soft coal that sat in the basement, and it was a network of high-pressure steam pipes that ran through the building like a jagged iron nervous system. To build without a crane, you didn't just need a lift, you needed a pulse. And the man who controlled that pulse was the hoister. The hoister was the priest of the pressure. He sat in the dark, usually on the second or third floor, tucked away in a corner where the wind couldn't blow out his gauges. He was responsible for the donkey engine, the steam-powered winch that provided the muscle for every single movement on the site. But to understand the hoister, you have to understand the physics of the abyss. A skyscraper in the 1920s was a giant chimney. As the building rose, it created its own weather system. The stack effect meant that air was sucked in at the bottom and blasted out at the top. This created a permanent freezing draft that roared through the open floors. But the steam engine needed heat. The hoister lived in a world of 110 degrees, while 10 feet away, the wind was 0. He lived in a thermal cage. If he stepped away from his engine, his sweat would freeze instantly. If he stayed too close, the heat would bake the moisture out of his skin until his hands cracked and bled. And then there was the vibration. A steam hoist doesn't run, it rages. The donkey engine was a reciprocating machine, 2 massive pistons slamming back and forth, turning a crankshaft that turned a drum. Every stroke of the piston sent a shock wave through the steel frame of the building. The hoister didn't just hear the building being built, he felt it in his teeth, he felt it in his spine. Veteran hoisters developed a condition they called the hum. Even when they went home to their tenements at night, their bodies would continue to vibrate. They couldn't sleep in a quiet room. The silence was loud. Many of them slept in the kitchen next to a boiling kettle, just to have the sound of the steam to soothe their shattered nerves. But the vibration wasn't just a nuisance, it was a warning system. The hoister could feel the weight of the load 80 floors above him through the vibration in the levers. He knew if a beam was snagged. He knew if a cable was fraying. He knew if the wind was pushing the derrick too hard. He was a mechanical empath. He was connected to the building by thousands of feet of steel cable that acted like a giant guitar string, and he was the only one who knew when the string was about to snap. How did the steam get to the engines? In a craneless world, the power had to be poured upward. This meant running miles of high-pressure steam pipes from the main boilers in the basement up through the center of the building. But steam is a temperamental god. As the hot steam traveled up the cold pipes, it would condense. It would turn back into water. This water would pool in the bends of the pipes, creating a slug of liquid. When the hoister opened his valve to lift a load, the high-pressure steam would hit that slug of water and propel it forward at 200 miles per hour. This is the water hammer. A water hammer in a 1920 skyscraper was a death sentence. The force was enough to shear off iron bolts and shatter cast iron valves. If a pipe let go on the 30th floor, the entire floor would be filled with live 300 degrees steam in seconds. The men called it the white ghost. You couldn't see it. In the dark of the building, the steam was invisible. You only knew it was there when your skin began to peel off your face. You only knew it was there when you heard the scream of the escaping pressure. To prevent this, the steam fitters had to live in the shafts. They were the plumbers of the abyss. They had to climb the vertical pipes, checking every joint, every trap, every valve while the building was swaying. They had to bleed the lines, releasing the water into buckets while the steam hissed inches from their eyes. If a steam fitter was slow, if he missed a knock in the pipe, the hoister would lose his pressure. And if the hoister lost pressure while a 10-ton beam was in mid-air, gravity would take over. The skyscraper was a machine that couldn't stop because the interest on the loans never stopped. The banks, the giants like J.P. Morgan and Chase, were charging thousands of dollars an hour for the money that built these towers. To pay the debt, the building had to rise. It had to rise faster than the interest, and that meant the night shift. Working on a skyscraper at night in 1930 was an experience in sensory deprivation. There were no portable halogen lights. There were only arc lamps. An arc lamp is a primitive, violent form of lighting. 2 carbon rods with electricity jumping between them. It created a light that was a cold, brilliant blue-white. It was a dead light. It didn't illuminate, it carved. It created highlights so bright they would blind you, and shadows so black they looked like solid objects. These were the ghost gangs. Their job was to do the heavy moving that was too slow for the daytime rivet rhythm. They moved the internal organs, the generators, the boilers, the massive elevator motors. How do you move a 20-ton generator to the 30th floor without a crane? You roll it. They would hoist the generator on the material hoist, a process that took 4 hours and required reinforcing the hoist cables with doublers. Once it reached the floor, it was pushed onto the raw concrete. Then the men would place rollers, iron pipes, underneath the machine. They would use pinch bars, 6-foot iron crowbars, to nudge the 40,000-pound beast forward 1 inch at a time. Imagine doing this at 2 a.m. in the dead light of the arc lamps. The floor is wet with dew. The wind is howling through the empty window frames. You are leaning all your weight into a pinch bar, your boots slipping on the concrete. If the generator starts to roll, it doesn't stop. A runaway on the night shift was the ultimate nightmare. Because of the stack effect, the wind inside the building at night was unpredictable. A gust could hit the generator, giving it just enough momentum to overcome the friction of the rollers. There are accounts from the construction of the Rockefeller Center of a ghost gang that spent 6 hours trying to stop a runaway boiler that was sliding towards the edge of the 40th floor. They didn't have brakes. They didn't have a winch. They had to throw chocks, wedges of wood, under the rollers, but the weight of the boiler would just crush the wood into splinters. The men had to sacrifice their own tools, their heavy wrenches, their pry bars, jamming them into the rollers to try and bind the machine. They stopped it 6 inches from the edge. They didn't get a bonus. They didn't get a thank you. The foreman just told them to get back to the bar. By 4 a.m., the ghost gangs were husks of men. They were covered in grease, their eyes were red from the arc light burn, and their lungs were heavy with the soot from the steam engines. They would descend the ladders as the day gang was ascending, the passing of the torch. The day gang looked at the ghost gang with pity. The ghost gang looked at the day gang with envy. They were 2 different species living in the same steel skin, but never seeing the sun at the same time. We have talked about the Bellman's code, but the skyscraper had another voice, the whistle. Mounted on the steam hoist was a brass screamer. It was the general command for the site. The whistle didn't just mark the start and end of the shift. It was a siren language that told the story of the day. 1 long blast, start work. 2 short blasts, the hoist is jammed. 3 short blasts, the paymaster has arrived. But there was one sound that everyone feared, a series of short, sharp shrieks, rapid fire, over and over, the death whistle. This was the signal that a man had fallen. When the whistle shrieked, the building died, the rivet guns stopped, the engines were throttled down, the clatter of the hammers vanished, replaced by the terrifying sound of the wind. It was a mark of respect, but it was also a safety count. Every man had to report to his station. The foreman would walk the floors with their clipboards, checking names. Sullivan, here. Ricci, here. Mohawk John. Silence. The whistle was the building's way of saying, I have taken my tithe. I am hungry, and I am not finished. For the men who built without cranes, the whistle was the heartbeat. They lived by it, they died by it, and they feared it more than they feared the abyss. Because as long as the whistle was blowing, the building was winning. And in 1930, the building always won.